The parasha that we're going to read this Shabbos, it's interesting because it has many different topics. One of the big topics in the parasha is about the requirement that the Torah makes to listen to the instructions and the institutions of the rabbis. But one of the topics that gets a little bit overlooked is that it talks in a fair amount of detail about the principle of a prophet. So he tells us, in this week's parasha, Hashem tells us that we don't believe in all these other kinds of future fortune tellers. We don't believe in, it lists a whole bunch of them. There was the Oiv practice, and the Yudoini practice, and the Mechashvim, and the Koismim, and the Ma'oinanim, and the Menachashim, and the Dorshim el-Amesim. If you look at it, the amount, it was obviously very prevalent in those days for people to try as best they could to predict the future based on all these strange practices. So the Torah tells us very clearly in this week's parasha, it's not a Jewish thing. It's not what we do. We don't buy into any of those experiences. Instead, he tells us, Novi Hakim Lecha Mikir B'cha. Hashem promises us through Moshe that over the course of history we will have prophets. And Moshe even goes so far as to say that the prophets will be similar to him. He was the greatest of all prophets. So there's this indication that there will be prophets through the course of Jewish history. And if you have a look at our early history, there were many, many prophets. From the time the Jews left Egypt, when they had Moshe, who the Rambam calls Rabbon Shel Kol HaNeviim, so to speak, the prophet of all prophets, right through the entry into the land of Israel, where they had Yehoshua, through the period of the conquest, through the period of the Shoftim, the judges, and then certainly during the period of kings, there were many, many prophets. Some of them are very well known to us, like, let's say, for example, the prophet Yeshaya, Isaiah, Zechariah, Yirmiyahu, Yechezkel, and others who did not necessarily publish books. But there were many, many prophets. Often at one time, there were dozens, even hundreds of prophets. And then it kind of seems to have all just stopped. You get to a point in history where they have the three prophets, they're called so-called minor prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. That's at the time after the destruction of the first temple. It's in the Babylonian exile, and they kind of seem to be the end of it. So much so that the Gemara says that after the Nevi'im Acharonim, which is basically those three, Nistalka Nevuah. Prophecy seems to have left the Jewish people. And for many people, that is how we see it. Prophecy is once upon a time. It was wonderful during that golden age, so to speak, of Judaism, and now it's a thing of the past. That's what you would think. So you would think that prophecy is ois, it's over. But once you look into it a little bit further, you'll notice a few interesting things. One interesting thing, which is perhaps quite involved, there's a sikha that the Rebbe talks about this in great detail, and it's quite an advanced sikha. But basically the Rebbe, using the conclusion of the Gemara in Zvochim, now Zvochim is a Gemara that not many people run to learn. It's all about the sacrifices, and for many people it's complicated, and it's also apparently not relevant to us. And that's exactly the question that the Rebbe asks, because at the end of the Gemara Zvachim, it talks about a scenario that is so remote, that sounds like it could never happen. It's only been recorded once in history. And that is the scenario of what happens if you have a prophet who tells the community to temporarily suspend one of the laws of the Torah. Obviously, it's very clear from last week's parasha that if a prophet tells you that you can permanently change any part of the Torah, he is immediately to be discredited and even to be dealt with very severely. But if he says temporarily that we can suspend a mitzvah for a temporary period of time, if he has the credentials of a prophet, you're required to do what he says. What was the one instance in history? So there was a very well-known prophet called Eliyahu Hanavi. I'm sure you've heard of him. Tends to be quite popular. He's probably visited your house once or twice on a Pesach. So Eliyahu Hanavi, lived during a time where the Jews were caught up in a cult that was called Baal. Baal was a very prominent, popular form of idolatry in those days. And you had Jews who were, I know it sounds funny to say it this way, but they were Jews for Baal, which meant that they participated in shul and whatever it was on a Shabbos. And then whatever day of the week that Baal had their services, which was, let's say, a Sunday, so then they'd go to the Baal temple. So they'd go to the shul and then the Baal temple, back and forth. They'd go to the Beis HaMikdash and the Baal temple. So Eliyahu goes and he calls the leadership of this particular cult and he challenges them to say, is your deity true or is Hashem true? And in order to prove who's right and who's wrong, he does what is called, very interesting, he builds a bomber. Never heard of a bomber? I'm not talking about a president of any country, but so a bomber. A bomber is a mini mizbeach, it's a mini altar, which is anywhere outside of the Beis HaMikdash. Now, once upon a time, in early biblical history, bomos were common and bomos were permitted. But once they built the Beis HaMikdash, it was no longer permitted for a person to have their own personal altar anywhere else. There's only one place that you're allowed to bring sacrifices, and that is on the Mizbeach, the primary altar inside the Beis HaMikdash. End of story. So the fact that he built a bama and brought sacrifice, because his challenge was, we're going to put an animal, we're going to slaughter an animal, put it onto this bama, and you'll pray to Baal, and ask Baal to send a fire down from heaven to consume the sacrifice. And if yours doesn't work, then I'll pray to Hashem, and we'll see if a fire comes down for me. And obviously they did their whole thing, and the incantation, and the fire dance, and whatever they did, for hours and hours and hours and hours, and nothing happened. Eventually, when it was late afternoon, Eliyahu says, okay, listen, you've had your chance, and now it's my turn. And he ordered them to pour water, to build a gully around the Mizbeach, around the bama, to fill it with water, to douse the place with water. And then he just said, Aneni Hashem, Aneni, Hashem answer me, and boom, a fire came down and consumed the sacrifice. And then of course all the Jews caught a wake up and they said, Hashem hu ha'elekim, like we say in Yom Kippur, that Hashem is the true God. So now Eliyahu built this bama outside of the Beis HaMikdash, which is against the Torah. So that's the one example that is used of if a prophet tells you to do something which is contrary to what the Torah says, if it's temporary, like that was, it was for one day, then you are not only allowed to, but you're obligated to follow him. So the Gemara in Zvachim goes into a lot of intricate detail about how and what would it take to build a bama nowadays. So the Rebbe says, why are you even asking the question? Cannot be done. Ever since the time of the Beis HaMikdash, nobody is allowed to build any kind of an altar anywhere until the Beis HaMikdash is restored, although there's some halachic debate with perhaps you could do it on the site of the Beis HaMikdash, even if the building is not there. But outside of that site, it's not even a question. So why would the Gemara go into so much detail about building a bama if it's something that you and I can never do? There's many other more practical things that the Gemara could have discussed and should have discussed before it got into that particular conversation. So one suggestion that is given, the Rebbe rejects, I'm not going to go into it. So he says it must be, because we know that the only time you could build a bama is if there's a prophet, and the prophet comes along and tells you, I have a message from God that under these circumstances, in this particular time, it is correct to build a bama. So the fact that the Gemara goes through all that details must imply that it is possible, even today, for a prophet to come along and to tell us to build a bama. So now you'll ask yourself a question, but didn't the Gemara tell us that the golden age of prophets ended? Chagai, Zechariah, and Malachi were the final prophets, and since then there have been no prophets. Finished, end of story. So he says, if you go back and you look at the Gemara where it talks about that, the Gemara in context speaks about many things that ceased to exist. And most of the time it says, such and such a thing was bottle, which means it totally ceased to exist. When it comes to prophecy, the Gemara says, nistalka. Prophecy left us. There's a big difference between saying something has ceased and saying it has left us. If you make a comment that something has ceased, then you say it no longer exists. If you say it's left us, that means that we no longer deserve it. In fact, there are quite a number of places throughout Torah where we talk about a decline over the course of generations. And so there's certain things that we are no longer capable of that the older generations or previous generations were capable of. So the implication in the Gemara itself is not that there will never again be a prophet until Mashiach comes. It's just not common, but it's still possible. Not only that, there's a letter that the Rambam famously wrote to the community in Yemen. It's a very fascinating letter that grappled with issues of faith. They were a persecuted nation, going through a difficult time, and he wrote to raise their spirits and to try and, many of them felt that they had lost their connection to Judaism because of circumstance, and the Rambam wanted to reassure them. In that letter, the Rambam goes into a whole calculation. He says, if you look, we have the story of Bilam, who was a Gentile prophet who came and prophesied various things about the Jewish people. And in his words, there's the implication of prophecy returning to the Jewish people. So the Rambam says, do a calculation. How many years into history did Bilam come? So you work it out, it's 2,488 years. Right, just before the Jews went into the land of Israel. So the Rambam says clearly that 2,488 years from there, there'll be prophets again. That's what he says. If you calculate it, it works out to just a few years after the Rambam's own passing. That's when he predicted that we would have prophets again. And then he says, furthermore, he says, and I know of a man who arrived wherever it was, and he was able to prove that he had the credentials of a prophet. Which is interesting. So the Rambam is clearly of the view that we can again have prophets in more, so to speak, modern times. What is also interesting is when the Rambam writes in halacha. Now, obviously, when you say something in a letter or in philosophy, it may or may not be binding in practice. But when you write something in an halachic book, then it is binding in practice. When the Rambam writes about what it takes to become a prophet, he says clearly that it's possible for a person to work on themselves to achieve a certain spiritual level, and at that point they will immediately experience prophecy. It may not be the same level of prophecy as previous generations, but it's immediately accessible. Never once in his halachic book does the Rambam say there's a certain period in history where there cannot be any prophets. So when in this week's parasha, when it talks to us about the concept of having a prophet, it's quite interesting for us to know that that's not just historic, biblical, or ancient history, but it is actually possibly something that could happen in our own lifetime. That we could actually experience somebody with prophecy in our own lifetime. Something to think about, right?